Good afternoon. Welcome back to Portland State University. We're very happy to be here. This is the penultimate great decisions of this year. Great to have you with us for this ride as we get back into the wide world of in-person programming with this little bit of the hiccup with the hybrid. We've got people at home tuning in. Our home audience. And glad you could be with us. If you missed one of the topics that we've had in the series, they are all up on our YouTube channel. You can see them all, including last week's excellent talk on war crimes with Becca Feathers. Coming up next week, our final talk, we have Gina Miller-Johnson from George Fox University, who will be talking about economic warfare, AKA sanctions, which is a really great topic, I think, to have on the tails of the subject of Iran at the crossroads. Some things to know. We have April 28th, we just announced, is Bridge Together. It is our annual fundraiser, formerly known as WorldQuest. We are going to be hosting this at Daimler Trucks North America. Stunning place. They have a truck in their lobby. You can either attend in person or you can attend virtually. It should be a wonderful evening. It is up on our website. You can find out all the information there, April 28th. WorldOregon.org is the website. If you do not know that, I probably say it 4 or 5 times each week. So hopefully it is burned into your brain. We have some wonderful visitors in town this week. We have visitors from 15 different African countries looking at climate crisis. And we've got a lot of you maybe who have offered to host them for dinners. And we want to thank you for doing that. We will have more opportunities in the future for more hosting. And we have a couple different public events we are working on, including, yes, the International Speaker Series will be coming later this spring. And so stay tuned for that. If you're not signed up for our weekly e-news, I think most of you are. If you're in this room, you probably are. That's the way you stay abreast of everything that is happening in our world. So today, I don't want to delay things too long. Oh, but I will tell you this. Who has one of these? Who doesn't? Today, they are now 50% off. $17.50 for you today from Good Family. We make a deal. So we've got them outside while supplies last. Take them home, give them to your kids. You can fold them. They make stocking stuffers. They're fantastic. 8 key topics that will never get old. So anyway, on to today's program. I'm really happy to have back with us Robert Asaadi. If you've attended Great Decisions in the past, you have probably seen Robert speak. He also recently was part of a program with Taravat Talapasand, who teaches here at Portland State, talking about the protests in Iran. And he really is wonderful at giving context and perspective on what is a very complex relationship that we have had, not just over 40 or 50 years, but going back much further than that. Actually, 1953, we're at the 70th anniversary of the Mossadegh coup, aren't we? So something to think about. Anyway, Robert Asaadi is an instructor in the Department of Political Science at PCC, previously taught here at Portland State University. He holds an MA and a PhD from the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota, where I also attended, and a BS in Political Science from the University of Iowa. His research and teaching interests includes international relations theory, international security, modern and contemporary Iranian politics, and U.S. foreign policy. His first book, Post-Revolutionary Iran, The Leader, the People, and the Three Powers, was published in the spring of 2021. And in fact, he spoke for us about that book. And let us give Robert a big hand. Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Tim, for that introduction, and thanks to World Oregon for inviting me. Really appreciate you all taking some time out of your day to be here. I have my strict instructions to stay at the podium, so I usually like to walk around, but I'll be here for video purpose. So apologies if it's not as dynamic as I might have hoped. So I'm really happy to be speaking with you again about this topic of as the reading put it, that corresponded with this event, Iran at a crossroads. So as Tim mentioned, I was just with World Oregon in December talking about the recent protests, the Woman Life Freedom movement. So I suspect maybe some of you were there. So I'm happy to talk more about the specifics of that in the Q&A, but what I decided to present today is something a little different. So I notice in a lot of the discussion on Iran today, the idea is everything that's happening is totally new. And I want to push back against that a little bit and instead draw our attention to a longer history of the struggle for greater freedoms and greater civil liberties that has been going on in the country for many decades. And so one quick plug, if I may, my department at PCC is actually allowing me to teach a brand new course. That's what you see on your screen right now, all about modern Iran, modern Iranian politics. And some of you may not know, if you are an Oregon resident, age 62 or older, you can actually audit the course at no cost to yourself. So the course is open. You can register now if you're interested. And I'm happy to talk with you more about that at the end if you'd like. So I want to begin actually with a fable. Some of you, maybe if you're familiar with Persian culture, you know that maybe what Aesop's fables are to the Greeks. There is a rich tradition in Persian literature of these fables that involve animals. And so I'll share one with you. I'm not going to tell you what I think it means, but maybe you'll find something useful in it. So the fable goes something like this, to summarize. There is a lion and a fox. The lion, of course, is the king of the jungle, the king of the domain of all the animals. And the fox is basically his sycophant, his companion. So the lion goes around and, kills an animal and takes what he likes, and then the fox gets the leftovers. So it's a good relationship for the fox, and the fox sings the praises of the lion, tells him how great he is, and so on. Well, this goes on for some time, and of course, the lion starts getting a little older. It's a little weaker, a little slower, is not hunting as much, and the fox says, "Wow, I've really got a problem now." So the fox says to the lion, "Oh, great lion, you're not what you used to be. You need to get strong again." And the lion says, "Well, I know, but what I need is the heart and the ears of a donkey. If I can eat that and pray to God, then I'll have my strength back and we'll be back in business. The problem is the donkey won't come near me. The donkey's afraid of me. It stays away." So the fox says, "I'll fix the problem for you. I'll convince the donkey to come and that you want to be his friend, and then you can strike." So the fox does exactly that. He goes to the donkey and says, "Donkey, the lion wants to honor you. Come join us." And the donkey, being a donkey, agrees and takes the bait. And the lion tries to attack. The problem is the lion is so weak, the donkey gets away, just injures the donkey, and the donkey runs away. And now the lion says, "Oh, what can we do? I lost my chance." The fox says, "Don't worry. I'm so clever. I can convince the lion that you were just trying to give him a big hug, but you're so strong, it scared him." The fox does exactly that. The donkey's, not the smartest, so comes back. And sure enough, this time the lion strikes, kills the donkey. The lion says, "Now I have to go do my ablution. I have to go pray." So the lion leaves the kill and goes to pray. And while he's gone, what do you think the fox does? The fox eats the heart and the ears of the donkey. The lion comes back and says, "Fox, what have you done?" And the fox says, "If that if that donkey came back a second time, surely it had no ears, it had no perception, it had no heart, it had no ability to reason." I think there's a lot in this. I'm not gonna didactically tell you what it means, but these types of fables, or maybe it doesn't even have a singular meaning, these are fundamental, I think, to trying to understand the Iranian psyche in a sense, and we often neglect such stories and focus only on Islam, for example, as formative to Iranian culture. So I wanted to share this with you. In part, what I want to share today is inspired by a book review I wrote in Political Science Quarterly on a book by a professor at the University of Indiana named Hussein Banai called Hidden Liberalism, Burdened Visions of Progress in Modern Iran. And he goes back all the way until the 18th century and studies basically liberal reform movements in what was Persia and what became Iran, and tries to understand what is alive in such movements for the current situation. So I have a lot to cover. I'll try to limit myself so we have plenty of time for Q&A, but I want to go back. If we want to talk about modern Iran, we have to talk about some of these guys with really cool mustaches and beards, right? So we have to go back to what historians call the long 19th century, basically the period from the French Revolution until the onset of World War I. And so in Iran, this was marked by first imperial consolidation under a dynasty called the Qajar dynasty. And these are some of the really important shahs or kings in the Qajar dynasty. And this, I think, helps us understand the struggle of the idea of the Iranian state in the first place. So if we look deeply at Iranian history, basically it's a story of empires emerging, consolidating power, expanding, and then fragmenting. And in part, this is also the story of the Qajar dynasty, which is an important context to say what happened in the 20th century and indeed what's happening now. So here's some of the Qajar leaders, and they rule as monarchs, as absolute monarchs. So this is also significant that when we talk about Iran, we're talking about 2,500 years of monarchy against 44 years of the system that the country currently has, which is called an Islamic Republic. So the whole idea of the current system is relatively new in the broader sweep of Iranian history. So the Qajar Shahs in the 19th century operated in governing relatively with a free hand. They were the deciders, right, as George W. Bush described his presidency. And it's not until the early 20th century that this really starts to change. So simple diagram, if we wanted to describe what did politics look like under the Qajar state? Well, basically it was a politics not of democracy, right? Not of reciprocal accountability between the state and the society, but of hierarchy. So the leader, the Shah, and his advisors and companions subject the rest of their domain to their authority. So there's an absence of direct accountability. However, there is this important kind of elite segment of society that we could call the local notables. This could be religious leaders. This could be large landowners, tribal leaders, influential merchants, and so on, leaders of neighborhoods. And they do have some independent sources of legitimacy. They have a closer relationship than the Shah with the people themselves. And so those notables are able to have the ear of the Shah and influence him in some way. So I wanted to provide this context of like, what does state-society relationship look like? To say, yes, it's a monarchy, but there is some influence from the elites. And so we can talk about maybe how this functions today in regard to the leader in Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. Does he have any need to refer to the contemporary version of local notables today, or does he operate totally with a free hand? We can pick up that discussion if you're interested. So what happens to the Qajars in the 19th century? Well, as it unfolds, they start to encounter great powers from outside of the region. So what I'm showing you in this map is some territorial concessions that happen to Persia under the Qajars. losing some territories in what's now Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russian Federation, and the Caucasus. Those were historically part of Persia, but because of a series of military defeats with the Russian Empire, they start losing territory. So you can imagine the subjects, and especially the local notables, are not happy about this. It's a state in decline. So not only are there these military defeats, there's also an economy in decline. Now, mostly in relation to the British Empire, we see a number of commercial and diplomatic concessions that the Qajar leaders agree to. The Reuter concession, which gives up control over all railway construction, road construction, navigation of rivers in the country. It gives it all up to British commercial interests. So it's a huge concession of really the lifeblood, the arteries and veins of the country. The banking sector is put under control of British banking interests. The reading that accompanied this talk talked about the concessions in the tobacco industry, which was a huge industry in Iran in the late 19th century. Control of the tobacco industry was given to British commercial interests. And actually that case sparked such widespread protests that the Shah had to rescind the concession. A good example of the state changing behavior in response to popular discontent. So through these series of military defeats, commercial concessions, there starts to be a new idea that maybe monarchy isn't working so well. Maybe we need some form of a republican, meaning an elected government. And that's exactly what happens in the first decade of the 20th century. So I'll move through this just in the interest of time, but a big spark was even further kind of concessions to the British and the Russians, who at this time were referred to as the northern neighbors, the Russians, and the British neighbors, or the southern neighbors, meaning the British coming through the Persian Gulf. So because of the incursion of these colonial powers, there's pushback from Iranian society to say, no, we actually need a way to hold the Shah accountable for his actions. So we see emergence of new social groups, both from the religious clergy, who have a certain degree of traditional authority among at least some in Iranian society, and this new emerging middle class in the bazaars, the merchants, who also have considerable influence. So what do we get? Like I mentioned, in the first decade of the 20th century, there is something new, which is a constitutional revolution. So Iran, they pass some fundamental laws, basically constraining some of the freedom that the Shah had in domestic and foreign policy, creating a parliament, establishing rules for elections. And so this becomes a really important turning point if we think about the broader history of liberal reform in Iran. So August 5th is Constitution Day. Here you can see the leader. This is Mozaffar ad-Din Shah, who is Shah at the time when the Constitution is established, and there's this big change. So why am I telling you this story? I think there's a good insight here in how change happens. So is it the case that those in favor of the monarchy just completely gave up and said, yes, we'll accept this democratic reform? No. So what followed after this constitutional revolution was a civil war. The next Shah who comes in, Muhammad Ali Shah, opposes these liberalizing reforms and instead works to undo them. So here, a picture you can see just the first members of Iran's parliament from 1906 to 1908. So the early seeds of the idea of democratic accountability, and then the pushback, the conservative resurgence against that through the new Shah. So what happens? Well, those who had advocated in favor of constitutional revolution, including some members of parliament, find themselves in jail. This picture showing some constitutionalists in chains in Tehran following the military coup in 1908. Those who weren't jailed, many fled into exile. here showing some of them seeking refuge at the embassy of the Ottoman Empire in Tehran, and so on. And so what happened after this? Well, an open conflict, the country descends into civil war. So just, I want to show you some more pictures of what this looked like. So here's some of the pro-parliamentary, pro-constitutionalist fighters from the northwest city of Tabriz, including some very important figures, leadership of that, Sattar Khan and Bagher Khan, who the historian Ervan Ibrahimian talks about. I definitely recommend his book, A History of Modern Iran. It's one of the citations in the article that accompanied this talk. Who else was fighting on this side? So we have basically what we see, it's so fascinating, a number of groups from the periphery of Iranian society and the Iranian state. So ethnic minorities from the Northwest, tribal groups from southern Iran. These are members of the Bakhtiari tribe or ethnic group fighting here outside of Esfahan in June 1909. There's another picture of Sattar Khan, other leaders from this person from Gilan province, which is around the Caspian Sea, which also has many non-Persian ethnic minority groups. So I will make an argument that, part of what we're seeing today in Iran is, where is a lot of the protest activity coming from? It's coming from the peripheral regions. It's coming from Kurdish regions. Even the young woman herself, Mahsa Jina Amini, who her death in police custody sparked the current wave of protests, herself was a Kurd from the Kurdish region. Also in Sistan and Baluchistan, ethnic minority province in southeast Iran. So part of the story of the Iranian state is the difficulty with bringing all of this vast, diverse territory under single rule. This was a struggle of the Qajar leaders. This was a struggle of the previous monarch in Iran. And it remains a struggle for the Islamic Republic. Iran is a very diverse society, has many different ethnic groups, not only Persian, and in fact, even the kind of homogeneity of use of the Persian language is relatively new in Iran. In, say, 50, 60 years ago, if you would travel to some peripheral regions, you would see many other different languages other than Persian being spoken. So what ends up happening? Well, the constitutionalists in the civil war end up carrying the day. They succeed. These different groups from the peripheries converge on Tehran in July 1909. The Shah flees into exile, starts a pattern of Shahs fleeing into exile when things go south. And a grand parliament is convened. And some in that group say, we want to abolish the monarchy altogether. That opinion ends up not carrying the day. They say, okay, we'll retain the monarchy, and the 12-year-old son of the former Shah will become the next Shah. So okay, maybe it sounds something like Game of Thrones here, that I can see that. So 12-year-old Ahmed Shah Qajar becomes the last Shah of the Qajar dynasty. In the early period, it's his uncle who serves as the Shah's regent, who is supportive of these liberalizing reforms. So what happens then? Well, basically the misfortune is world events intervene. World War I follows, and this early energy toward forging a new path in Iran at the sake of international strategic interests gets basically nipped in the bud. Iran has the misfortune of a number of bad years of harvest, outbreak of cholera, and by the time we get to 1920, Iran is basically a failed state. And so what do we mean by that? The state isn't able to project its authority really outside of the capital. And there is kind of public fallout from capitulations by the government to the British and to the Russian Empire before the Bolshevik Revolution, such that Ibrahimian, in his book, he describes the situation in 1920, the late Qajar period, in this way. He says, the owners of property had grown so desperate that they were looking for a man on horseback with drastic measures to ward off anarchy on one hand, state failure, and the Bolshevik position on the other, the idea of the spread of the Bolshevik revolution into Iran. And that was precisely what they got in the person of Reza Khan, who becomes the first Shah of the final Persian dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Khan's biography is fascinating. I would recommend if you have time to read more about him, but he basically comes from a very modest background and rises up through the ranks of the Iranian military through one specific brigade called the Cossack Brigade, which was under Russian leadership. And he is a man of action. You can see even this picture from 1921. Reza Khan is a tall, imposing figure who's about a head above everyone else with the greatcoat. And Ahmad Shah Qajar is standing next to him, leaning on a cane. So even from that, we can get an idea of, who's really in charge in this picture, who's the power behind the throne, we might say. So eventually the Qajars are no longer able to sustain their position, and Reza Shah assumes the new role in 1925 as the new Shah of Iran, and starts this new dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, which would consist only of himself and his son. So this is what you kind of think of maybe, or what you're familiar with thinking about the Shahs of Iran. To tell a very complex story very quickly, all in one slide, what happens after 1925? Basically in the 1920s and 1930s, Reza Shah, I should say, implements top-down reforms to try to address the fragmentation of the Iranian state under the Qajars, in a way very similar to Ataturk in Turkey, of trying to modernize the country, which for him means try to make the country secular, push Islam and its influence to the side, try to look as much like Europe and the West as possible, even down to legislating ways people should dress. During this time, the hijab, the Islamic headscarf, is outlawed in Iran. So this continues. The dilemma for Reza Shah is World War II, where he tries to maintain Iranian neutrality. That doesn't go over so well with the Allies, and they end up occupying the country. And I had to include, being from Iowa, I had to include how Iowa City Press Citizen reported on this. Allied forces sweep in on Iran. So the Allies occupy the country. In 1941, they basically force Reza Shah to abdicate the throne. He flees into exile, first goes to Mauritius and then South Africa, where you see him there, gaunt, tragic figure compared to how he was in the early 1920s. He dies in exile in South Africa. And his son is, the Allies basically say, well, what are we going to do with Iran? Maybe it would be too destabilizing to try to establish a republic here. So let's keep the monarchy, and we'll let the son, who was then 21 years old, maybe even, some of you in this audience close to this age, you can imagine, 21 years old, he assumes the peacock throne, the Pahlavi throne, where he would sit until he's ousted by the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So what follows, the young Shah is in power, but there is still this new revitalized influence from Iranian society. So many of the constitutionalists from the 1910s, 1920s, who, when Reza Shah came in, were isolated from politics, or he basically put a lid on their opposition, many of them reemerge in the 1940s and start to be more vocal. The first large movement was a socialist movement. And there you see their logo, Hezb-e Iran, the party of the masses. And so this is a socialist movement who has majorities in Iran's parliament in the 1940s. It's not until a failed assassination attempt against the Shah is, historians debate whether wrongly or rightly, attributed to a member of the Tudeh party, that they are officially banned. Then where does opposition to the Shah, how is it manifested? It comes through not socialism, not Islamism, but nationalism, secular nationalism, through a party called National Front, whose leader emerges, like Tim mentioned, Mohammad Mossadegh, who goes on to become prime minister in 1951. And I love to include this image here in the middle. I don't know if anyone can read that script of what it says on that sign. Maybe I'll just say, so it says, "Yankee, go home." So not even translating it into Persian phrase, but just saying. So a lot of what the National Front and Mossadegh's policy was about was maintaining independence and sovereignty for Iran, not wanting Iran to become a client state in the context of the Cold War and the competition between the US and the Soviet Union, to the extent that Mossadegh, through the parliament, was even able to nationalize Iran's oil industry. So this becomes the spark for the British intelligence and the CIA to work with some monarchist factions in Iran and in the Iranian military to oust Mossadegh in August of 1953 in a coup where he's removed as prime minister, and basically the military's selected candidate, a man named General Zahedi, is installed in that position. And here you can see one image. So one of the pro-Shah figures going through a public square in Tehran with a huge portrait of the Shah, denouncing Mossadegh and denouncing the nationalists. And so this becomes a really pivotal moment in Iran's history, where again, like following the constitutional revolution, there was energy toward liberal reform. It was squashed by the reactionary forces. Again, in the 1950s, energy toward nationalism, elected officials being the ones who control the levers of government, and through this coup d'etat, it's ended. What this starts is basically a 25-year period from 1953 until 1978, where the Shah is ruling really as an autocratic leader. Now, there's, sorry, just let me go back. So there's a number of things that he, programs that he implements, which have very positive impacts on the human development in Iran. For example, programs to advance literacy, to bring education to rural areas, for instance. So I don't want to paint a broad picture to say it was all just, all just negative. There was progress, but the grievances that kind of bubbled up during this period were, one, in part, going back to the very idea of the constitutional revolution in the first place, that the Shah is not an elected leader, he's not accountable to the people, and some in Iranian society simply did not want to maintain this system. The other big critique had to do with how a lot of the country's resources and money was being spent. So these images of the imperial grandeur and lavish lifestyle of the Shah were spread through the pages of Western media publications. Here, one from 1960. The Shah is on the cover of Time magazine. The Shah and his wife there at very lavish ceremony. How was all of this sustained? Well, it goes back to a large extent in the denationalization of Iran's oil industry. So after the coup, Western oil companies, including some from the United States, were invited back into Iran, and they established an oil consortium, just a group of many different companies, and they agree to a profit-sharing deal with the Iranian regime, where they say, we'll do everything, we'll drill the wells, we'll do the exploration, we'll extract, we'll refine, and we'll give you 50% of everything we earn. Now, of course, who's counting, who's keeping the books on what constitutes 50%? You can guess, the oil consortium. But even that notwithstanding, this is a huge amount of wealth. So how is Iran spending that wealth? Well, a lot of it is being spent to build the idea of the, palaces for the Shah, and kind of being spent as a personal patronage network for the Shah to sustain his power. And a lot of it is going back to the very same Western companies or very same Western states who were drilling the oil, only this time it's going to arms manufacturers. So here in the US and throughout Europe, Raytheon, Lockheed, Boeing, and so on. So by the time we get to 1975, Iran has one of the largest militaries in the world, the 5th largest military in the world. And a lot of it is sustained by this spending. So over time, there's some backlash to this. And here's some pictures that I took in 2013 when I was in Iran. Many of the Shah's palaces, the Islamic Republic has maintained as kind of museums to the corruption of the Shah as they see it. So here's one of those in Tehran, 54 rooms, 10 ceremonial halls, all appointed with the finest, European fineries, however we might put it, drapes and chandeliers, imported from all of the most expensive producers in Europe, Persian carpets that would fill this entire room many times over, and so on. Here's another one, Niavaran Palace, which actually President Jimmy Carter visited in the late 1970s to toast the Shah as overseeing an island of stability in one of the troubled regions of the world, as he put it on his New Year's Eve toast to the Shah at that time. So what's the problem then? Well, the problem is, even under this quite autocratic state, the Shah, has a secret police force called the Sabak, which infiltrates Iranian society and makes sure, no one is saying anything bad about the Shah, no one is forming anti-regime parties. Even under this system, a two-party system that Iran had at that time, the two parties were New Iran and People Party. And the joke in Iran was they were really the party of yes and the party of yes, sir. So even under that system, there was starting to be some voices saying, we're disagreeing with these modernizing reforms. We want to have more accountability. And so in 1975, the Shah abolishes the two-party system and says, we'll only have a single party now. It will be the Resurgence Party. And guess who will be the head of the party? Me, the Shah. So you get these kind of dystopian images of the huge portrait, looks Orwellian in a way, the Shah's son and his wife to his side. So the intended effect of why would you eliminate the party system and create a single party? You're trying to stabilize politics in the country. The story, the effect was exactly the opposite, that this experiment with the single party state further weakened the regime, isolated the regime from society, just like how the Qajar leaders were isolated from actually what was going on. They only could communicate through local notables. The Shah himself was arguably even more isolated than his predecessors. And now the question's, where will opposition come from? The socialists have been outlawed, fled into exile, many to the Soviet Union. The nationalists were crushed through a military coup. And so the final arena in Iranian society, which was still able to organize and mobilize, was in the mosques. And so Islamism as a political ideology becomes the voice of opposition. And so here we see one image from December 1978 of the unthinkable happening. Even a year prior to this, it would have been inconceivable to imagine in the street burning a portrait of the Shah. And this accelerated so quickly that once people started to observe, protests are happening, it just accelerated so quickly, such that by February 1979, the Shah goes into exile. The figure who emerges as a leading voice in this revolutionary movement, Ayatollah Khamenei, returns from exile from France. He had been exiled since 1964, first in Iraq and then eventually in France. for criticizing the Shah's reforms. He returns. Following that, there's an initiation of this new system called an Islamic Republic, and that has been in place basically for the last 44 years. One thing I wanted to note in this is we should not lose sight of the fact that from its very inception, the meaning of this revolution was disputed. The revolution included not just Islamists, but liberals, socialists, Democrats, conservatives, secular and non-secular people. And even among the non-secular, even among the clerics, there was a deep division over what's the appropriate role for religion in politics. Should religious leaders be at the head of the system, or should they be in a more advisory capacity? Should we have elected leaders like imagined in the constitutional revolution or not? So it's really through the historical events that unfold after February 1979, arguably most importantly, the invasion of Iran by Iraq in September 1980, that now this kind of radical openness that follows the revolution is quickly brought under, is quickly rescinded in the context of wartime. And the early leaders are able to take on a lot more power for how they're governing the society, how they are repressing any opposition, because the context is now the country is facing an existential threat of war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who is being supported by many great powers around the world, including the United States. So that is a very fast-forwarded version of about 150 years of Iranian history, but I think it's essential in helping us understand what's happening right now in the country. So I showed this in my talk in December. The protests that have been happening right now, I think we can, the first bubble here says citizen. So what is the average person? What choices are they facing politically? Well, they are experiencing a real decline in the material conditions of their life. Unemployment in Iran is extremely high. Inflation has been hovering between 40 and 50% for many years. Right here in the United States, we are, speaking like it's a catastrophe to have 8 or 9% inflation. Imagine what's happening in Iran, how that affects the price of everyday goods you want to buy. And of course, the restrictions on freedom, civil liberties, personal rights, particularly for women, particularly for ethnic and religious minorities, all of these bubbling up forces of discontent in society. So what can the person choose? Well, they can choose to leave, and many Iranians have. This phenomenon called brain drain of highly skilled, educated people leaving the country. This has been a huge drain on Iran's economy for the last 40 years. You can also choose to just simply disengage from politics, try to stay away from the state in any way possible. So some choose this path. Others choose, well, I'll try to remain loyal to the regime, maybe try to get as much benefit as I can. Imagine maybe if you work in a public sector job, or you're somehow, the livelihood of your family is tied with the regime, you may be more likely to remain loyal. Or you can choose voice. You can choose to express your discontent. And what I would argue is the state has a role here too. So when people protest, and Iranians have been protesting since 2017, really, with increasing frequency, having to do with the number of these economic issues, and last fall having to do with questions around gender inequality and police brutality. When they protest, what does the state do? When the state responds with repression, killing protesters, which somewhere between 400 and 500 protesters by most human rights accounts since September have been killed in the street in response to protesting. You can jail protesters. You can charge people, with the death penalty. When the state responds in that way, I would argue that complicates the idea of remaining loyal. You have to look, each person will have to look very closely at themselves and say, how can I defend what it is my state is doing? The state certainly tries to reframe its efforts to justify it by saying protesters are actually foreign agents and so on, and other kind of quite dubious claims. But what the way I think about what's happening recently in Iran is a kind of funneling Those who have exited have exited. Those who are in the hardline supporters of the regime, they've made their choice. But increasingly, more and more people are choosing voice and protest. And I want to just conclude by showing you some data. So I'm starting to work a lot more now in public opinion polling. Like, how do we know what Iranians think? It's great to look at protests and, we can observe these events as anecdotes. But in last few years, there's actually been a lot of great polling done of nationally representative samples of Iranians inside Iran, asking them, what do you think about the future? What do you think about the government? What would you like your political system to look like? And so let me just quickly review some of these for you. So this is from a group called Iran Poll, which is based in Canada, which conducts telephone interviewing polls of nationally representative samples of Iranians. And you can look at the trend. When people are asked, how good or bad is the country's general economic situation? It's deteriorated significantly from May 2015 until July of last year. Nearly a third, right, saying it's very good. So people are having a negative outlook on the economy. Do you think things are getting better or getting worse? Similar trend. 49% in May 2015 said things are getting better. Only 28% in July of last year said things are getting better. How confident are you that the current administration in Iran, the current president is named Ebrahim Raisi. He came into office in August 2021. Do you think his administration will be able to lower inflation? The very confident measure has almost halved. Do you think he'll be able to lower unemployment? Same thing, erosion of confidence. Do you think he'll be able to root out corruption in the state? A third said very confident, now just north of 20% in the July 2022 poll. Unfortunately, this is from another group based at a university in the Netherlands that also conducts polling inside Iran. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll just skip over this, but similar trends. Basically, a lot of Iranians here, maybe I'll conclude with this one. When you ask a sample of Iranians, what type of political system would you like the country to have? The overwhelming majority favor a democratic political system. So that's what the dark green and light green is showing. What do you think this is a good way of governing your country? Together, 88% say democracy, having a system governed by religious law, basically the current system, down 28%, either very good or good. So there is still a constituency in Iran that favors the Islamic Republic system. And so the question is, will the majority of Iranians, if we believe this data, be able to influence this group, or will they kind of remain as they have for the last 4 decades on the outside looking in? So yeah, I have a lot more to share. One last one, maybe, if you permit me. Thinking back about this history of monarchy in Iran, this survey asked a really fascinating question. Which design for Iran's national flag do you prefer? So the one with the lion holding the sword with the sun behind its back is associated with the monarchy. And it's fascinating that more Iranians, 46.2%, preferred the flag associated with the monarchy than the one with the Islamic Republic, which the emblem in the center says Allah or God. And so that's kind of fascinating. I mean, there was an interesting episode around the World Cup where some television broadcaster portrayed just red, white, and green and excluded the Islamic emblem in the center, and it caused a big negative response from the Iranian government. So something to think about. Do I think it's true that a majority of Iranians want a restored monarchy? The polling data does not bear that out. The polling data says not a return to monarchy, not a maintenance of Islamic Republic. In fact, if you ask Iranians if you could vote again, either in favor or opposed to Islamic Republic, very robust majorities say they would vote against Islamic Republic. And so I wanted to share that, and maybe we can pick up more in the Q&A. So a lot more to say, but I think maybe I've said too much already. So thank you.
Thank you.
Just wanted to thank again our speaker. Just to note, we have a short window of time here, so I'd ask that keep your questions brief. We're going to bounce back and forth between in the room and online. If you've asked a question in a recent program, maybe you hold back for just a sec to see if someone else has a question. Want to make sure too we get this big contingent of St. Mary's students. If you have a question, it's always great to get a student question. So Tim, I'll let you go first, and I'll get one in the back of the room.
Thank you, Derek. You actually took the words right out of my mouth. So Robert, the big news today was that Iran and Saudi Arabia have renewed diplomatic relations with a little bit of a midfield assist from China. Some of the backlash so far says, from Israel, for instance, says this shows the US's weakness on Tehran. Where is this going to go, and what is this going to mean for the US?
Yeah, thanks. So I was just reading about this morning, and this is a problem, something new every day. So just to provide a little context, right? Iran and Saudi Arabia have been in a kind of staring contest across the body of water that Iran calls the Persian Gulf and Saudi Arabia calls the Arabian Gulf. I was just in Qatar in January, and I can affirm that there's a big cultural difference between the Gulf Arab states and Iran. In 2016, in January, Iran and Saudi Arabia paused diplomatic relations because a Shiite cleric in Saudi Arabia named Nimr al-Nimr was executed by the Saudi government. And so in response to that, there was protests at the Saudi embassy in Mashhad, a large city in northeast Iran. And so it was this diplomatic fallout since 2016. And despite the efforts of some regional states, notably Oman, who's kind of a peace broker in the region, they hadn't been able to come together again. And through China, just like you mentioned, they just today announced they're going to restore diplomatic relations. One, I think it shows us that the ability of the United States to be a broker in the region is at a low. For sure. Iran has just last year formally joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is an intergovernmental organization started by Russia and China. It now includes India, Pakistan, a number of Central Asian states. Iran was a longtime observer. They are now a member. So it shows us a real pivot of Iran toward Russia and China. We know the story of Iran supporting Russia in the conflict in Ukraine very well. And so, one thing to keep in mind is the vast majority of Iran's oil that flows out of the Gulf doesn't go to Europe. It goes east. It goes to the markets in East Asia. And so I think they're trying to shore up that relationship as well. Long term for the region, aside from U.S. interests, I think there is a good cause for optimism that this might finally help move things forward a little bit with the situation in Yemen, where basically Saudi and Iranian proxies have been fighting now in a civil war in Yemen for some years. So I would look to see in the next few months what actually happens in Yemen as a result of this.
Great. We have a question in the back of the room here.
As a Portland State person, I wanted to ask, and I can ask you later, if you were a Portland State teacher, if you got to talk or meet with Qureshi, an Iranian who was president of our school. But I promised Nicole, who's the principal of St. Mary's Academy, to ask this other question, which is about 79. Do you think, it may be in the article, that Jimmy Carter, when the embassy was seized, basically supported the Shah and helped the CIA train Sabak to torture the people of Iran, and also whether Bakhtiar historically you may think, was he socialist and was similar to Kerensky, that he was in and out between the Shah and the Khomeini?
Yeah, great question. So it's definitely true that following 1953, when the Shah is kind of reinstalled, as a leader, that there's close collaboration between intelligence agencies in the U.S. and the Shah in developing the Savak in Iran. And we know, their methods were influenced by not just the CIA, but also the Mossad and other intelligence groups. So that's part of one of the consequences of the 1953 coup, was this association for many, I could say, or at least some Iranians, of the Shah's regime with the United States, and that they're the Shah does whatever his, the briefing says from Washington, D.C. every morning. In terms of the provisional government of Iran, after the revolution, there was Khomeini, and then there was, the more secular provisional government leaders. I don't know if that's what you're referring to. Yeah. So he had a famous quote where he said that he had the power put in his hand, something like this, or he had the weapon put in his hand, but there was no bullets or something. So I mean, I don't know. So the suspicion is that he was a socialist. I don't know if that's the question. So that's not my understanding of his orientation. I mean, that may very well be true. I think it's a little bit outside of my familiarity. That's an interesting suggestion. Yeah. Okay.
Reminder, just we're going to hold off on comments from the audience because it doesn't transfer to the audience online.
Yeah,
So
right.
sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I would just say, to talk about what was going on in 79, I think perhaps it's important just not to lose sight of the fact of the broader international context of the Cold War and the fear of losing a loyal ally in Iran to the West, that it would turn toward the Soviet Union perhaps more. But, Ayatollah Khamenei, for example, was deeply critical of the Soviet Union as well, as kind of the godless, the atheist socialist regime and so on. So even the establishing relations with the Soviet Union took a period of time as well. But that's a fascinating question. That may very well be correct.
So we've got a question online from one of our viewers. Works perfectly with what you were just talking about, which is, could you briefly characterize the relationship between Iran and Russia?
Yeah, I would say, the relationship between Iran and Russia is, really one born out of the isolation that Iran has faced in the last 44 years, economic sanctions, also the regional piece. Iran's oldest Arab ally in the region is Syria. That is also an ally of Russia because Russia has some strategic interests in Syria, including a military base on the Mediterranean coast. So there's no, in part, it helps us understand how the Islamic Republic really behaves strategically. There's no ideological affinity between Russia and the Islamic Republic. It's really a relationship born out of strategic concerns. And so to the extent that Russia supports measures favorable to Iran in the United Nations Security Council or blocks maybe more robust punishments against Iran, I think they view that favorably. It's interesting in the context of the war with Ukraine, there's now been 2 UN General Assembly votes. In fact, the second one was just a few days ago, marking the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. And the measures are condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine. And in both cases, Iran abstained from those votes. You could either vote yes, no, or abstain. Some small group of countries vote no, including Syria, Eritrea, North Korea, Belarus, Russia, of course. So Iran doesn't go that far. They are kind of fence sitting in a way. I don't view it as an enduring partnership. And in fact, this pivot toward China might make close alliance with Russia less necessary strategically for Iran. So that will be interesting to see.
Great. So we're coming up on time. I'm going to ask one more question. You hinted a little bit at things around the protests which started last fall. And these protests, the Women Life Freedom protests, were not the first protests, and we've seen a lot of moments of protest, but they've certainly garnered a lot more global attention than other protests have. I mean, they're seismic. I don't know in the Richter scale of protests how seismic that is, but one of the questions was, how much have these protests really challenged the ideology? And is the Republic still a revolutionary state that can survive this? And is there still, as an Iran watcher, some notion that regime change could be some light at the end of a tunnel?
Yeah, a lot there. I mean, maybe I'll just focus on the first piece that, like what I was showing you of from 78, 79, burning of the picture of the Shah, for example, and how like unimaginable that would have been a couple of years before. The language, the rhetoric, I could say, slogans around what has been happening in the last few months. We should make no mistake, like they're not oriented toward reform. They're a direct, full frontal assault on the raison d'etre of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they're calling for an end to the regime. They're, saying yeah, I mean, it's incredible actually how directly focused these are. It's not end the hijab law, for example. That now I think it's reached such a point for many, especially young people, and around 50% of Iran's population is 30 years old or younger, similar to Turkey and Egypt in that way. In the US, that number is more around 40%. Japan, it's around 28%. So Iran has a quite young population, and these people obviously never lived under any other system than the Islamic Republic. So the argument from, say, like my parents' generation or grandparents who may have said, well, it's not perfect now, but it also was not great under the Shah either for many. That appeal doesn't resonate to the same degree for young people. And so I think it's pretty unambiguously saying we want systemic change. So, yeah, that is a big shift, I would say. Will that automatically lead to regime change? I don't think it's not that simple. The state still has a role in this, and states use a whole range of tools to try to re-legitimate their authority. It could be some reforms, it could be continued repression, it could be trying to reframe what's happening, basically telling people what you're seeing is not actually what you're seeing, and here's what it is instead. It could be trying to reward loyal supporters in some ways. So the state still has a say in this, and society will have to respond based on that. One thing that I really appreciated about the article that accompanied this, and by the way, there was a quote from another Minnesota professor, William Beeman, a longtime professor of anthropology at Minnesota. He said, well, what's the role for the outside world? Basically said, the United States in particular should allow what's happening in Iran to be decided by Iranians themselves protesting against their government, that it would be a huge strategic misstep. And I disagree with this. I agree with this as well, that US, say, military involvement in Iran would completely delegitimize the efforts of the reformers and would give a blank check to the regime to say, all of this is just foreign subterfuge. And so, it's painful to watch what's happening in the country, but there is value in bearing witness to history, and human rights groups are doing this. So, if you feel a real compulsion to do something, I would say support the work of human rights groups that are operating in Iran, and raise awareness of this cause and learn as much as you can about the history as well. That is action as well, and it has real value. Thank you.
Again, thanks to Robert for once again a really, really wonderful way to help us think through what is a very, very complex issue. Very, very much appreciated. Thank all of you for being here today. Just a real quick shout out to Kathy Moyd, who is a member and has made this series possible for us with her generous donation. It makes it so people can stream this wherever they are. And when you don't feel like being here in person, you are able to stream it as well. So a big thank you to Kathy Moyd and to Portland State University. Hopefully we will see you all next week for a discussion on economic warfare and sanctions. And be well, be safe, and go forth. Thanks.